Okay, so we last left off talking about this idea of the follicle maturing and went through via the cartoon, this development that's occurring of these other cells in the follicle aside from the oocyte. I do remark here again, just to remind you that the oocyte remains a primary oocyte until right before ovulation. So when we look again, reviewing this idea of how follicle changes over time, we say that before puberty, right, in fact, from the point of birth till puberty, you only have these primordial follicles. And I've said this a couple times. So you only have this primary oocyte with these, right, simple squamous cells, granulosa cells. So again, primordial follicles have squamous cells that are known as granulosa cells. After puberty, a few of these will start developing every day and become primary follicles. So again, the biggest change is going to be in these granulosa cells. All right? And these granulosa cells increase in size and number, and they become cuboidal and no longer squamous. All right? So secondary follicles, right, are going to form as these follicular cells keep dividing, and they have so many cells that they are forming layers, and they have some connective tissue layers now with enough cells, and some blood vessels and thecal cells, as well as, granulosa cells. So these thecal cells look distinct from the granulosa cells inside. These thecal cells and granulosa cells that are part of this follicle are producing estrogen. So a lot of estrogen being made before ovulation, right? Because this is preceding ovulation. The primary oocyte produces a membrane at this sometime as it transitions from primary to secondary, and they would have a zona pellucida, this nice sugary protein here, and seen in the real slide here. And then as we transition to a tertiary follicle, then we'd have a large fully formed cavity called an antrum. And here we have the spaces forming. So this is again developing, so this is a secondary follicle, right? This is the tertiary that would have a well-formed antrum. Okay, so again, how all of this is controlled is through, right, hormones, and we call this the ovarian cycle. These changes, right, occurring in the ovary. Does that make sense? So I said, again, the process takes time. The final parts of it are, right, final stages of the development of the tertiary, because it's the tertiary follicle that will ovulate, is about 28 days for the final stages of produce a tertiary follicle, and this then leads to the ovulation of a secondary oocyte is actually 28 days. So again, a few follicles are constantly developing in human females. It's just that the last stages are fairly predictable and fall into a 28 day. Once we get to this point, there's only 28 days that we're going to be counting to look at these changes. And what I'm saying here again is this ovarian cycle really starts functioning at puberty, right? So this is how you're going to become fertile. The hormones secreted by the hypothalamus anterior pituitary are the same as the ones in males, right? Gonadotropin releasing hormone, right? Follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone. The target now is, of course, the ovaries, and this controls development and maintenance, right? So maintaining or keeping female secondary sex characteristics, breasts and fat and hair patterns. And maturation of female sex cells, right? Oocytes. And furthermore, changes during the monthly reproductive cycle. So these, again, the ovaries are controlling, they're being controlled by this, and then they are controlling these things. All right, so here's what we call the follicular phase. All right, so this is the start and development of the follicles, and we just went through the steps of going from primordial and so forth, but if we put these all together, it's called the follicular phase, and it's controlled by these hormones. So we're now looking at these stages and how they're being regulated. So here we have the hypothalamus, right, communicating with the anterior pituitary, which communicates with the ovaries, and the ovaries, of course, communicate with the uterus. So I'm saying here that follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone made by the anterior pituitary, right? And this is follicular phase. I'm going to ignore ovulation for a moment. We'll start producing a whole lot of gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which triggers the release of these two hormones, and they move through the body and the blood, and they bind to cells, follicular cells, in the ovaries, so granulosa and thecal cells. And as they bind to these, they get these cells to start making a whole lot of estrogen, right? And the form we talk about is estradiol, but it's estrogen. So FSH, follicle stimulating, stimulates the cells to grow. So that's one of the reasons why you go from being, squamous to cuboidal and then several layers. Luteinizing hormone stimulates the cells to produce the estrogen. So again, luteinizing hormone is very similar in its effects in females as males. It's just that in females they make estrogen and not testosterone. And again, it's stimulating these thecal cells, right, and granulosa cells. So estrogen levels start to climb. As more estrogen is made, it will have a negative impact on GnRH and FSH and LH. So again, similar to what happened in the males. And as these levels fall, I say here that some of the follicles that started to develop die. And generally one dominant follicle will keep on going. All right? So the competitors basically drop out at this point, right? Just before ovulation, right? When you have only, so looking at this idea, when you have only one dominant follicle remaining, and it, at first there was a fall in the estradiol because of, over here, because of this negative feedback. But then the dominant follicle begins to produce and secrete estrogen again. And in this scenario, the estrogen goes so high, and I say here so much estrogen, that there is positive feedback. So the estrogen level has reached a point, and at that point, we're not blocking it, we're actually stimulating. So this is way different than what we talked about in the male. And because of this, right, high level of estrogen that stimulates GnRH, you will stimulate, right, more FSH and LH. So FSH and LH rise, especially the LH, the luteinizing hormone surge, is what we feel actually triggers the process of releasing the oocyte from the ovary, which we call ovulation. Right? So again, that tertiary follicle will rupture, and the secondary oocyte with its granulosa cells will leave the ovaries. So what happens after this? Well, so here's number 3. We call this the luteal phase, right? And so after that spike in LH, it's going to fall again. But because of this spike, not only do we release the oocyte, we also cause the remaining follicular cells to reconfigure, reform into a structure known as the corpus luteum, or the yellow body. All right, so here, right, this spiked, and in the ovaries, the targets, again, follicular cells, is getting them to become a corpus luteum. Now the corpus luteum, these remnant cells, begin producing lots of progesterone. So we talk about progesterone as the post-ovulatory hormone. And progesterone is going to be extremely critical to the progression of a pregnancy. So you really are preparing for that oocyte to have been fertilized at this level, or at this time. And it does have a negative feedback. So progesterone levels made by the corpus luteum keep rising, and as they rise, they do block GnRH and LH and FSH, which fall back down to very low levels in the blood, right? So, and there are no, because of this drop in GnRH, FSH, and LH, there are no new dominant follicles. So at this point we have a kind of a moratorium. There's no more follicles. They're just kind of, they cease for a brief period of time, their developmental pathway. All right. If there isn't a pregnancy, and pregnancy again marked by implantation in the endometrium, so if no pregnancy happens in 10 to 12 days following ovulation, the corpus luteum will degenerate. It'll die off and become the corpus albicans that you see here. There's one, and there's one. And this will also disintegrate later on in a few months, so these don't remain around forever either. As that corpus luteum dies, right, this structure right here dies, progesterone levels will fall because these cells were making it. This prevents more negative feedback, so no more negative feedback, and this means FSH and LH start increasing again. And this will initiate the follicular phase again, so we'll start over basically. What other structures help make reproduction work? Well, we look to the uterine tubes, also known as fallopian tubes or the oviducts. I've mentioned that they do not directly connect to the ovaries, and they're divided into sections. The isthmus is this narrow area here, connecting it to the uterus. The infundibulum is a flared funnel-looking structure with the fimbriae, right? And the ampulla is generally the site of fertilization, right? And then, of course, so they're fairly short tubes, but they have a variety of features and regions. So if we look at these histologically, you often see cilia, right? Here's a highly magnified image here, and here's one more akin to what we would see in lecture, or in lab, I should say. And so I say, you've got the tube itself has 3 layers, an inner mucosa that you see here, with columnar cells, yep, classic, and cilia, and they secrete to help sustain the embryo that might develop in here. And then there's a muscularis, so this is connective tissue, there'd be a muscularis down here, and a serosa, so typical layers. Following ovulation, the secondary oocyte and its follicular cells, right, known as the corona radiata, normally enter these uterine tubes, fallopian tubes, and the high estrogen that's still being made by these follicular cells causes this muscularis to contract, and cilia beat more strongly, and this drives, right, pushes the oocyte towards the uterus. If fertilized, we will have a zygote, right, and the zygote will start mitosis as it moves through the tube. If no fertilization occurs, the secondary oocyte simply dies and is reabsorbed. The uterus itself is a fairly small structure in a non-pregnant female. This is a nice image from histology. And your slides look very much like this, right? There are 3 regions. There's a fundus that's domed, there's a body, and then there's the cervix, right? And there are also 3 layers to this. The endometrium is the innermost layer, shown here histologically and here. And this is the functional layer. This is the layer that changes. The myometrium, which is muscle, and looks to be the majority of the wall here. And then the perimetrium, which is the outermost, connective tissue that really keeps it all together, right? It is attached to the body cavity through a broad ligament and a round ligament, and then there's a uterosacral ligament that also keep it all in place. So the endometrium, the innermost layer, is a functional layer, has 2 specific layers itself, so sublayers, if you will, both of them called stratum. There's a stratum basalis and there's a stratum functionalis. The basalis is next to the myometrium and is not shed. It doesn't slough off, it doesn't come off. It is the base and it stays there. The functionalis is highly glandular and surrounds the lumen. So this, right, stuff here, so up to about right here probably, that's all functionalis. There's just a small layer that's considered the basalis. So it's the functionalis that grows and thickens during the cycle. It is affected by the rising estrogen and progesterone we were looking at produced by those follicular cells. And also from the corpus luteum, what the follicular cells become after ovulation. And this whole process is preparing for pregnancy. Again, as I've already said, if there's no pregnancy, the corpus luteum degrades, degenerates, dies, and progesterone declines, and the endometrium itself dies, which is what menses is. So we'll finish this here and look at the rest of this process in the next video.